And Furness's Provident Bank, which will feature prominently in this story, is one of the ways that Price brothers learned about this. But Furness also, using new materials, the Provident Bank is spanned with steel trusses and they're exposed and all sorts of stuff is going on. Furness is saying, don't make architecture about history, make it about now. Use the materials that you live with, make architecture out of the world that you're part of. And so, who is Furness? Why does he matter? Well, the narrative was that he was either some crazy outsider or, the Vincent van Gogh of architecture who would cut off his ears and spite his face. And that was what everybody thought they knew in the 1970s, just a rogue architect, totally wild and crazy. I've been doing some research, and in the process, I've managed to change the narrative. The museum catalog with O'Gorman, we had 500 and some buildings, and said, he's a Victorian, he's part of the world he lives in. The Frank Furness, The Complete Work, stupid title, never used the word complete in the title. We did the first edition, we found another 50 buildings, we did an addendum to the book, The More Complete Works. We have 50 more, if we were to republish that, we would have to put the even more complete works. Just a horrible title. But what we did was we found photographs of about 500 of his buildings and put together a way to understand what he was doing, what his buildings looked like. Then I was asked to do a little book for the Academy of Fine Arts and their current restoration, in which I decided that you always want to be outrageous and you want people to get angry, and so I decided that the Academy of Fine Arts was the first modern building in the world. And everybody now says, oh, well, what about? And I say, oh, that's nothing. Furness here synthesized all of the systems of modern design. It's a logistically planned building. It uses the new materials of the industrial age. It has a primitive form of air conditioning. In every way, it's a building about the systems of the world that we now use. And he did it in this early masterpiece that ties this building to the industrial culture in which he was working, which is what all this stuff comes out of. It isn't European theory, it's out of the facts and industry of Philly. And then the most recent book is Frank Furness, Architecture in the Age of the Great Machines, that should have been titled Architecture in the First Machine Age, but Rainer Banham had written a book about architecture in the First Machine Age, talking about the 1920s. He didn't know anything. And of course, the real First Machine Age was here in Philly in the 1870s. And I couldn't say architecture in the first real machine age. So I did this. This book really lays out what I figured out about Frank Furness. Furness is working for industrialists. And they don't say, make me something out of history. They say, use the modern materials, make buildings that reference the world I live in. And Furness uses steel and iron and weaves them into modern life and makes buildings whose shapes tell you what they're about, and becomes the genesis, really, of modern architecture. This is the guy whose family background and everything tells this story in a powerful way. Just won the Victorian Society in America's best book of 2019. So get it while it's hot. I actually got a royalty check for this book from Penn Press. 10 years of work, $342.70. About a quarter of a cent an hour, but worth it. And Will has, as you know, been pursuing me as well, and I've been working on trying to understand him and tying him and Furness into the architecture of Pennsylvania, which was the big book that we called lovingly in our household TFB. It took 10 years. It's the fucking book. But that book wove the whole narrative of the industrial culture to explain that this isn't about being a Quaker. This is about being part of the modern world. So they're all there. And they undo this sort of standard architectural narrative that architecture came out of Boston and Richardson, who's doing historic stuff. What's that got to do with anything? Which somehow leads to Louis Sullivan, who was doing simple big buildings. I guess that's the connection, who teaches Frank Lloyd Wright, And from that, it all goes to the German Volga-Gropers. Huh? Huh? You know, how does that work? So, I didn't think it worked. That's where I went off. I've been coming up now with a new narrative, which is Furness to Sullivan to Franklin Wright. That all works. But what I want to do is add back into the narrative Will Price, George Howe, who also studied in Frank Furness's office, Lou Kahn, who studied with George Howe and got his first big commission from Howe at Yale, and then Robert Venturi, who worked with Lou Kahn and wrote the introduction to two of my books, one on Will Price and one on Frank Furness, and who was deeply committed to the power and importance of what Philadelphia architects were doing. So this is the narrative that Furness leads to and creates. And part of the narrative that's powerful is that Furness came from a family that was connected to the important American philosophers who basically said, forget Europe, turn your back on the past, make your architecture out of the life of the world you're in. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson. That's his point. But they're also supporting Walt Whitman, who is a family friend, is living over in Camden, who the Furness family is supporting. They're advocating his leaves of grass. It's all of this stuff is happening, and Furness is hearing it. And so my sense is that the literature, the theoretical underpinnings of an American architecture come from Furness's family. His father over there on the left went from 5-year nursery in Cambridge through life, never distant from Emerson. They spent the summers together. They went to Harvard together. They did the abolitionist stuff together. They were this major team. And their ideas then flow into the history of American architecture. And in the case of Rose Valley, what I remind you of in The Artsman is that they're quoting John Ruskin, who's one of the other figures. The editor of The Artsman, the co-editor, is Horace Traubel, who is Walt Whitman's literary executor, writes with Walt Whitman in Camden. This is all one big circle of people sharing a set of ideas that gets woven into the literature of American architecture. Sullivan quotes Emerson and Whitman. Franklin Wright quotes Emerson and Whitman. Will Price quotes Emerson and Whitman. This is the American narrative. But you also have to understand that Philadelphia is doing some really unique stuff that gives it its own architectural and cultural identity. It creates an architectural characterization in which progress is the goal, not repeating old forms. And I show you on the left a standard planar machine from the mid-19th century with big Ionic, or big, I guess they're Corinthian capital columns on the side holding up the frame. And 10 years later, William Sellers gets rid of all that stuff and just does a big iron frame with holes cut in it so that the worker can see through and see if somebody goes by, see if there's a workman in the way, can see how the belts are running. This is all part of making a design that is about how the thing ought to work instead of just throwing some piece of history to make it look important. And this is going to be the germ of a whole set of ideas that's going to change the nature of design. The guys who are doing this stuff are Frank Furness's clients, and you will see as well they become Will Price's clients. The interesting, I'm going to throw a lot of words at you. The really interesting thing is a lecture that Coleman Sellers, who's the chief machine designer for the Sellers Machine Tool Company, gives in 1874 that Louis Sullivan could have heard when he was in Philly. This is sort of part of the big narrative. And he's asked, why do you paint all your machines gray? And the assumption in people outside Philly is it's gray because they're Quakers. They don't do color. But he says, no, actually it's not about that at all. I'm doing gray because it's the color of the metal. And I don't want to distract you from the form and the operation of it. I don't want you to be confused by gold decoration. I want you to see the thing as what it is. It's a machine. And he goes on to say in a series of articles that fitness to intended purpose is how we judge beauty. And we don't judge it from history, we judge it from the quality of the thing. And he says that in the modern world, we've figured out that we need new shapes for new purposes. You can't just keep using the same old stuff over and over again. You've got to make the stuff down because the world is changing. And then his brother has the great aphorism that is, when a machine is right, it looks right. There's a relationship between form and purpose, which turns into Louis Sullivan 20 years later, after he's been in Furness's office here in Philadelphia, saying form ever follows function, which is the narrative that we all know. We've all heard that line. We just don't know where it comes from. This is where it comes from. It comes from the industrial guys in Philly making the big machines. And what I want you to see is that the industrial world of buildings were buildings that told you what they were about. So that when you looked at a factory building, you could see the monitors in the ceiling which told you that it was hot there and they wanted to dump heat and get more light for the workforce. And buildings that had few windows were often buildings that were designed to be fireproof because they had all their wood models in it. Each building told its story. If you're walking around Philly and you see one of those manhole covers and it says Samuel J. Cresswell, 22nd and Cherry, this is his plant, just demolished this year for a new set of crummy townhouses. But every time I see one, I go, oh yeah, I know that. And Furness then weaves this stuff into his book. This is the Academy of Fine Arts. Up in the attic, there's a gigantic industrial ventilator because the glass roof would heat up, get hot. It's like a greenhouse. And so Furness didn't want to cook the paintings, so he puts an enormous industrial ventilator there that is ganged on the interior with these big bars and devices, so you could crank the thing open from down below, and when it was hot, open the ventilator and draw all the heat out, which then sucked cool air in from the basement and cooled the upper levels of the building. It was a wild idea. It worked perfectly well until we in the 1970s restored the building and sealed all that up with air conditioning. We're now looking at could you put it back in operation and make the building greener. But Furness also did something else. Furness, in his buildings, told you about what was going on in the building by the shapes that he made. He didn't look at some historical thing. He looked at the world around him. And what I realized eventually was that the library at Penn, that everybody thought was some crazy building, some fortified greenhouse, was actually looking at Philadelphia industrial buildings that had a big floor plate for simplicity of interior movement and a big stairwell outside that kept all the noise and all the clutter and the bathrooms and everything outside. And this library is basically a machine for reading books that Furness is doing to work from the world that he knew. And behind, on the right, behind this Gothic addition that was supposed to swallow the entire building in the 30s, and luckily didn't happen because the Depression was actually a good thing for this building. Behind it was a book stack of 3 big arcades that Furness was planning to extend with 6 more arcades so the book collection could grow, as libraries are known to do. And in the process, the building could, in a sense, become like a big Philadelphia self-adjusting machine, growing the pieces that were needed to make it serve the future. Just very obvious, very important stuff. The other thing that Furness did was he really created a degree of freedom for Philadelphia architects in which they didn't have to look to New York and history. They could look to the world they were in and they could make their architecture out of it. And my sense is that it freed up Will Price, George Howe, Lou Kahn, Bob Venturi, gave them all the courage of their convictions. And Kahn moves to Philadelphia as a 5-year-old in 1905. On every block of downtown Philadelphia, there was a Furness building. Bob Venturi is born in Philadelphia. He's sent by his mother to the Unitarian Church that Furness had done. He goes to the Episcopal Academy, to a Will Price mansion, that's the lower school, and in every way he's wedded to this Philadelphia culture. And he sees it, and he hears what they're saying in Princeton about what architecture is, and he looks around in Philadelphia and says, not so much, and off Bob Venturi goes and becomes Bob Venturi. All of that's possible because Frank Furness had done a building or 2 or 5 on every block of Center City, Philly. But he also leads out in other ways. This is the very young Lou Sullivan, about the time he was in Furness's office. He describes Furness with this great fan-shaped, crinkled red beard. portrait of Frank at that moment. And he says that Frank made buildings out of his head, while his partner, George Hewitt, had his nose in books. And Hewitt looks like that, doesn't he? He looks like his nose would be sort of squeezed in books once in a while. Furness is the sort of the ex-cavalry officer, you know, heroic figure, very dynamic. And young Louis Sullivan says, this is who I want to be. I want to be Frank Furness. I don't want to be George Hewitt. But this will then lead Sullivan off in directions that will free him up to continue Furness's big ideas. One of the early surviving Sullivan buildings is the Jewelers Building that you can see on the Loop in downtown Chicago. And when you look at it, and the color and the detail and all the stuff, you're really seeing a kid who absorbed a lot from Frank Furness. You don't have to do history. You can make architecture be what it needs to be. Now, I want to switch gears and take you to the Price family and show you a little bit about what I've been figuring out about the Price family. This is the census for 1860 here in, or 1870 here in Wallingford. And it shows James Price as a nurseryman trying to make a go of it in the nursery world, which isn't working out very well. And go bankrupt and, you know, sort of pulls a Donald Trump for the moment. He doesn't pay his creditors. But you'll hear a cool story in a minute. Because he comes back many years later, finds the people he stiffed, and because he the last 10 years of his life, he actually figured out life. He becomes part of the industrial culture, and he then starts to pay off everybody with the stock from his new business and makes everybody rich. Very cool story. But you can see that you know, the kids are at school, they're living here in Wallingford. It's not terribly exciting. But 1872, he gets into the insurance business with the Provident Life and Trust Company, Furness Building there on the right, which is an L off the main bank that faces out on Chestnut Street that you saw in the beginning. So this is all one big Furness project. James is over there in the meeting of the insurance department in 1883. He always looks so pulled back. And this is now the family in 1880. And things have changed. They've moved into the city. He's called himself insurance. He's doing insurance. He's got two sons, one Frank Price, who was Francis, but after working in Furness's office, calls himself Frank, like Frank Furness, not Francis, like, you know, whatever. And then Will, who's also an architect, and they have now created, they're moving into the real world, and they're part of the new world. Really cool thing that showed us 15, 20 years ago. I got a call saying I was down at a theater, and they had this old book as a prop, and it was the Provident Life and Trust building records of the whole job, all in one bound volume. And it showed you all the job meetings and who was responsible. And up at the top it said Frank Furness Architect per AE, Allen Evans. Furness and Evans will happen this year. Over here, Frank actually signs it with a very vertical, square-off writing. And then down below is Frank Furness trying to imitate the writing, signed FLP. And that is going to become Frank Price. This is another version in which he's signing per now FL Price, and we now know exactly who he is over here on this corner. There's no doubt who it is. But what's happened is the old man working in the insurance department has said to the architect of the new building, "Could my kids work with you?" And, you know, he's a client. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, we could probably make that work. And so, off they go. And for the moment, Will is stuck with the Quaker architect Addison Hutton, who Will remembers that was pretty boring. It had lasted about 6 months. He jumps over to the Furness office. And then, within a year, this is 1879, you see Frank Furness and Frank Price both listing themselves as architects at the address of the Furness office. And then 1882, the two brothers have now formed their own practice, and they're working together a couple blocks away. So there's a real nice connection to the sort of character. So what's happening in the Furness office when the brothers are in the Furness office? And this is where I began to see that he wasn't doing the flamboyant stuff that everybody says that's a Frank Furness. He's doing outbuildings that are much more about the problem of the building. So these are little train stations that he does, and he has big porte cocheres on the back of the building, and then the porch extends right down to the track so that you can stay dry from your carriage to the train. The round tower in the front of the Graver station is the office of the station master, who can see the trains coming down the track and yell into the waiting room next door, trains coming. The buildings are these diagrams of how a train station ought to work. And every function has its own different quality and space. And the cool thing is that the station master is given his own housing upstairs, which means lots of bedrooms, and so the second floor is bigger than the first floor. Well, what it means is that the Reading Railroad is getting a free on-site manager all the time in exchange for housing, so it's a good deal for everyone. In his houses in this period, he's doing the same thing. Window size, building shapes tell you about what's going on in a building. On the right is the Griscom mansion out of the main line. On the right is the Shipley House, head of the Provident Bank, with an old stone house in the back that Furness has stuck this nose on, which is a library with windows on both sides and catches the air on the hill. And on the other side, on the left, is the Griscom House. Same issues. That these are qualities that the young Price brothers are going to be absorbing. Furness does lots of small country houses in which they seem symmetrical and they're not quite. And when you look at them carefully, you see that there'll be one window on one side and two on the other. So there's a slight enlargement, and you realize when you look at the houses that that's the living room versus the dining room with the center hall. And this will become sort of a standard characteristic of the houses that they do, is just sort of keep the office going, and we don't need to make a lot of expensive details here. Furness House on the left, the young Price brothers on the right. And what's really intriguing, if you look on the left, elongated, drooping brackets that are much too long and exaggerated. Over here on the Price brothers' house, the same detail, the same asymmetry, the same different sizes of windows to tell you about different things going on. They are learning from Frank Furness. They're picking up how architecture is done in the Furness mode, in which the house becomes, in a sense, a representation of what it is. And you'll see in a few minutes that Furness is going to build his own house just up off Idlewild Lane, off Manchester Road, his little summer house, which is a real hoot, because when you really look at the plan, you realize it is the library at Penn, which she's turned into a house. After it was claimed that the library plan was so unique that it could only be a library in Trenton. And he goes off and he does, the little round end is the reading room, and the thing sticking out is the front tower, and he's just larking around. The Price brothers are also looking at the same forms and the same character, and it becomes the nature of their stuff. And he does the Baldwin School, Bryn Mawr Hotel, and the Price brothers are doing gigantic roof, high chimney hotels as well. But something's about to happen, which you'll see in a moment. The other thing he's doing is he's larking on stuff. He sees things and he just has to play with it. So you look at the Palladian window over the door at Independence Hall. Furness does the Penn National Bank at 7th and Market Street. It's got a big plaque on the front that Furness designed, which is the sign on this site. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. They've since torn the bank down and built that fake colonial house that everybody should be appalled at. But then Furness takes the Palladian arches of the Tower of Independence Hall and he sort of stretches them out, he makes them bigger, and he stacks them up for the whole second floor. And he's basically saying, these forms aren't written in stone. They're not. They can't be. It's not that they can't be changed. You use them to your purpose. And 20 years later, when Will is out on his own in the new firm of Price and McClanahan, and they're doing a new reinforced concrete frame store for Jacob Reed's Sons, the old men's clothier in Philadelphia, Furness takes a Palladian window and he makes the whole facade out of it. He pumps it up and turns it into the whole lower wall of the building. And I see that and I think, okay, again, he's still remembering what Frank Furness was doing. And Furness was still working, so he's still seeing this stuff. This is still part of the world of these guys. Now, I want a little side trip. I needed to give Morris's side of the family in here. And this is Walter Ferris, who has followed the father. James, first of all, was a classics student, I guess at Penn. He gets a degree in classics. And so Walter, the second son, goes off and gets a degree in classics at Haverford, and then he goes down and he gets a degree in classics at Harvard, and he's planning to be an academic, and then he says, and he goes off and becomes an architect in his brother's office. So, this is sort of a sideline that got him out of town for a couple of years, but he really decided, all in all, he'd rather be an architect. So here's the family, and this is about 1888, as near as I can tell. Will's over on the left, Frank, formerly Francis, formerly known as Francis, and Walter in the back row, and then sisters, too numerous to count, all through here. And they're doing fine because the old man has suddenly realized he didn't want to be a teacher, hated the insurance business. He was an inventor. He's part of this industrial culture of Philly. And he starts figuring out how to make things that serve the new railroad businesses and the streetcar businesses. And all of a sudden, he has $1 million business. And he's selling stuff all over the country, and there's articles about him in Real Age. And it's just unbelievable how much money he's making. And so instead of living a tight little life, all of a sudden, Will builds his own house out in Overbrook. His father builds a bigger house right behind him, designed by Will. Life is really good. He's just suddenly a happy guy. And there's a great story that comes out of this. That at this point, he's made all this money, and he realizes that an African American in media had loaned him $100 for his nursery, and he'd been able to pay him back like 25. And he finds him with a lot of effort, and he pays him, that plus all the interest, all the way back. The African American guy said, I never imagined this. Nice little story. And James Price, unlike another real estate guy, is actually paying his debts, doing the right thing. A really good guy. And then in 1899, he dies. And you'll see this in a moment. What's interesting is that we've got some amazing records. Let's see, this is Frank and Will split, but Frank moves there, so there's a drastic. Frank's having difficulty. We have the record books of the firm that were in this lot of stuff that I bought. And when you look at it, you start to see, Will's getting $75 for the month, and Frank is getting like 10, and Walter is getting 5. And that tells you Will's the guy in charge. Frank gets a few other little payments in here. They pay whenever they have money in the till. They've just gotten a couple of nice jobs. They've got the Monroe Smith House, which is a huge mansion in West Philly. That paid $300, which is a lot of money in 1892. But all through the records, you'll see something like a surge of cash in the business from James Price. And then, a couple of weeks later, they start to pay it down again, and you realize that he's bankrolling the firm. They're able to create their office because he's made all this money in the railroad parts business. It's really cool. And you can follow individual projects. This is the J.L. Twaddle House out in Devon, in which he pays $100 for the down payment on his plans, and then another $45, and there's other payments through the job. This was a house that was owned by Gail Rawson, who was an old buddy of mine from the Academy of Fine Arts, who just sold the house and it's about to be demolished. So you want to see, well, don't cry. It's not a way anybody would want to live in the 21st century. It's sort of difficult. But the house in Scientific American, the plan, lots of little tiny rooms, and then the house as it is now, and I took some large format pictures of it so we have a record of it. And very picturesque and something, but a little windy stair like here as your only means of getting upstairs, how do you get a mattress up there? How do you get a twin up there? How do you get, you know, a full, let alone a queen or a king? You know, it's just like, what were they thinking? But yeah, outside with a hoist, maybe. You know, maybe you have a window that you bust out and bring in. It's just, anyway, just that. But what's interesting to see is all of these shapes are different functions. This is basically a Frank Furness house with a little bit of sort of an English veneer that Will is doing. And that tells you an important thing, that the Furness lessons are still showing up. The other thing I want to actually point out, look at the size of these chimneys. And then, remember Frank Furness, who always liked a really big chimney. Big chimneys show up all over the place, and they show up on the Price Brothers buildings as well. But with something has happened, and you can see it in the Allen Wood, later Mother Divine House over in West Conshohocken. Will has suddenly caught the history bug. And he caught the history bug because he went down and did that Kenilworth Inn in North Carolina, and right next door, the big draw that people are coming down to see is the Vanderbilt mansion down there that is Richard Morris Hunt, who had been Furness's teacher in the 1850s, who's doing big historicizing things, and Will gets caught up in it. What's funny is that the plan of Woodmont, Allen Wood House is very Furnessy, it's very compact, but all the detail is now French Gothic. And on the right is Alan Reed's house. He is Alan Reed, who will be Jacob Reed's son, who will do the store in Center City. And it's, you know, nice English, classical. We all know it, what it is. And Price is going to do this stuff for 10 years. And he will get a chance, as you will see, to break away from it. But even in the new stuff he breaks away, he still does big chimneys. This is the Blenheim Hotel in Atlantic City. And this continues. Lou Kahn does really big chimneys, and Venturi does really big chimneys. These are Furness chimneys up above. This is the model for his mother's house that they pulled the chimney down at 90%. This is a little beach house over on the right. But you know, chimneys were like a thing in Philadelphia because they tied you to the industrial culture. Now, I want to remind you that not all chimneys, what we're told, you know, sometimes they're just chimneys. Okay, just keep it. So, 1899, James dies. Will gets a big whack of cash and goes off and builds a big Gothic mansion right across the street from where he'd been, next to his buddy John Gilmore's house on Berwick Road off Sidney Avenue. And they furnished it and Gothicked it, and the kids were on the right is Margaret, and in the middle is Billy, left is Ruth. They Gothicked it and they did the whole thing, and Will says, pardon the vernacular, this really sucks. I'm bored. I don't have any of my friends around. My life is over. I can't believe I'm just living the life and it's awful. I can't deal with it. And he says to his poor wife, Emma, yeah, I know you're probably enjoying the house, but we're going to sell the darn thing, and we're going to move out to a decrepit industrial village near Media, and we're going to live in a guest house for a couple of years until we get our house fixed up. You're going to love it. It's going to be great. All of our buddies will be around us. What could be better? We don't know what Emma thought of it, but one can wonder. But the other thing that happens is that when he starts riding out to Rose Valley and gets off at Moylan, the other guy likely riding the train is Frank Furness. Because he's going to walk up, a quarter of a mile to Otterwood Lane to his house, just as Will's going to walk a quarter of a mile down here to his house. And you can imagine the conversation that Frank Furness, still doing buildings that are all steel inside and are modern, tough buildings, saying, still doing history, Willie? But at this moment, Will has had an event that I suspect a few of you in the room have had, which is that he's turned 40. And he's turned 40 in 1901, in the first year of the 20th century. And he realizes he's going to spend the rest of his life in the 20th century. He's not going to be in the 19th century, a number that starts with 1. He's going to be in the 20th century, and in that configuration starts with 2. He's in a new time. 20th century is a big deal. 20th Century Fox, all of the 20th Century Limited. Think of all the times 20th century shows up. It's new, it's exciting, and Will's going to live there, and he realizes he doesn't have to live the past. And he begins to think to himself, wow, I gotta get with it. This is gonna happen to George Hab, who's doing sort of French pastoral country houses until he turns 40. And then when he turns 40, he says, I'm done with that. And he does the PSFS skyscraper in Center City and major modern mansions, and he just forgets history. So this is something that's an important thing. But it ties in with the ideas and values that Frank knew about from Ralph Waldo Emerson, in which he tells you that Europe's over, that America has to make its art out of the world that it's in. That's where life is. And Frank has been saying that over and over in the office. His father preaches at the Unitarian Church. This is a major, major idea. And Will's heard that, but he's ignored it for the 10 years between 1890 and 1900. As soon as he starts the new firm, he starts figuring it out. On the left, Frank Furness's B&O train station, a room entirely of glass, steel, and concrete, all modern materials telling the story of industrial Philadelphia. You get off the train, the B&O line from Washington, welcome to industrial Philadelphia. We like steel here. Big sign. Will Price, when he does the Allegheny train station west of Pittsburgh, does the main concourse with just massive concrete beams. No decoration. This is it. This is the world we're in. We're part of a new world. Just an amazing space. Demolished. Louis Sullivan is saying a lot of the same stuff. He's saying really important things that we are called upon. He says, this is a lecture he gave to the Architectural League in 1899, and I think Will Price was there. We are called upon not to betray, but to express the life of our own day and generation. You will realize in due time that the fraudulent and surreptitious use of historic documents, however carefully plagiarized, however neatly repacked, will be held a betrayal of trust. And that's what Frank Furness saying. You just hear Frank Furness saying, that's not who you are. What are you doing? And Louis Sullivan says that. And Will now creates a new firm with Hawley McLean in 1903, and he begins to write the same ideas. The only thing worse than ignoring the precedent is following. And when you hear that, you can hear the language of the Furness office. You can hear what Louis Sullivan was hearing. You can hear what Frank and Will were hearing in the Furness shop. The past is over, the future is ahead of us. So they come out to this little dying mill town, they buy it, and they have to create something that will give them a new opportunity. A row of houses on the far side is going to become the guest house. These are the little houses that were the manager's houses of the mill. And what, of course, is amazing is that this intentional community of 1901 still survives in many ways with art as ideas that are still alive in the lives of the people that live here. This is, to me, one of the most profound revelations of Will Price, that he could have an idea that was strong enough that it would survive generations. But in his article, Is Rose Valley Worthwhile, he says, we are slowly gathering people who do things, writers, musicians, craftsmen, art workers, and those who think the simple life with some human touch worth more than the show and strain of your ordinary communities. He means overworked. He means the big suburbs in which everything is becoming the same. You see Will in the back in the shop. And they're working what? But the bigger thing is that Will lives what he believes. He doesn't have his big house with other big houses. He does Price's Lane and does little tiny houses next to it, so his buddies can all come and live nearby, so that the community that he wants to be part of can be part of this world that he's a part of. He doesn't want a world in which people can only live together because of what they have as resources. He wants them to be there because they're good people. So that becomes the core of what Rose Valley offers. And then he begins to think about what can he do with this moment, and he does this house, which you all know. But the really neat thing is he begins to break away in all sorts of forms. I love this stair photograph, which is really neat because you can see he says in one of his texts about this house that the wood is gilding and nothing other than wax. It's cypress and it's just wax. It isn't stained dark. Somebody screwed it up a little. Big project for Ryan to get on that. He's got to start to look at how he moves that and gets it back to the just wax cypress, which will be really beautiful. You see the grain. See how beautiful it is. And then the Thunderbird fireplace on the second floor, which looks like something Lou Kahn would do, 50 years later with the same types of openings. These all become part of the world that he's part of. And his houses become simpler. He gets rid of the extraneous detail, and he moves into just planar surfaces with tile set in, and he begins to ask, how do I do architecture of the moment? And he does hollow tile construction, because hollow tile has the grooves already built in, and you can just slap the stucco directly on it, and it bonds. It's a really simple system. You can use it for barn towers, you can use it for whatever, and he does fabulous houses. This is the McClanahan house that is now unfortunately demolished. And then he starts thinking about what this all means, and he says, convention decrees that we still make precedent our guide, accepting our taste without analysis, second-hand. It fills our streets with Italian and French renaissances, and our countryside with Spanish and English houses, which may or not be very beautiful, but certainly is not American, and therefore is not art. Rural fact. And the little houses out on Porter Lane begin to show this. He begins to do houses that are just about their materiality, that in the windows and the shapes, he looks back to Furness and he tells you what's going on, and he makes these buildings that are some of the most remarkable, inexpensive modern houses. This is not a Frank Lloyd Wright Roby house, this 200 feet long and costs tens of thousands of dollars. These are, $2,000 houses that are designed to be accessible to people. He works with a palette of materials that goes from the outside into the inside, so that there's a continuity of character. These are qualities that modern architects play with, and Will is doing. The other thing that's going on in Will's life is Will has an office in Philly, but the industrial culture is turning into the children of the industrialists, and they've all gone to Penn, and they're all studying art history and law, and they're just not interested in new stuff. And so he follows the industrial culture west and finds them alive and well in Indianapolis, which is where they're making all the new stuff for automobiles. And he puts together a circle of clients out there who will put together the Indianapolis Motor Speedway because they're making car parts. And he will set up a second office in Indianapolis because he can take the overnight train, sleep overnight on the way to Indianapolis, get out in the morning, somewhat refreshed, work in that office for a day or two, catch the overnight train back, and not miss any time at the office. And he'll have a stroke at 56, but that's... Then he begins to do buildings all across the country. He does train stations all through the Midwest. The first one is Allegheny, now demolished. The second one is Steubenville in Ohio, which is spectacular. I hear that's not the way you pronounce it. I hear it's pronounced Steubenville. That's gone. The far one is an amazing freight terminal he did in Chicago. And then he does a whole cluster of amazing houses in Indianapolis. And those car guys, 2 years after Will dies, will grab the firm and head to Miami Beach, where they're going to do an automobile resort using Will's firm for all the new buildings down there, which is pretty amazing. So, and then of course Will's going to do some hotels in Atlantic City, and this is the vastly enlarged world that Will gets involved with. And the station in Steubenville is just gorgeous. Elongated, you know, he's looking at the landscape, he's saying the up and down stuff I do in Pennsylvania isn't what I should do out here in big flat prairie, so he has his own version of what we call the prairie style. This is an amazing house in Indianapolis for Frank Wheeler, who will be one of the guys in Miami. Just elegant, wonderful, modern house. We did an engram on Will Price and modernity. I looked up the word modern, and what you can see is in all of the publications that Google has scanned, that the use of the word modern is on the rise during Will's life. This is a really important term. It's going to go all the way up to 1930 when the Depression's going to hit, and then World War II, and everybody's going to go, oops. But he's living in the era that's really intrigued with modern. And I tried modernity, and that just has a little tiny bump around the time that Will dies, and I'll tell you what that means in a moment, because there is an important connection there. But when Will goes out to Indianapolis and does their train station there, they don't have a phrase to describe it. They say that it's an architecture of no style. The Victorian they know. Over here is just new terracotta in beautiful streamlined forms that Price's office is designing, and they can't say what it is. It's something new. And Will continues writing, and he tells us, if our American life is halfway worth the boast that we make for it, why is it not good enough for our inspiration? Better to lay two bricks together in the new way that tells a tale than to build a temple for the money changers with no thought in it less than 2,000 years old. He's referring to Frank Furness's Girard Trust Bank down at Broad and Chestnut, which he didn't like. But you begin to see what he's grappling with these issues. How do I tell this story? And he tells it in the Trainwalk, where he basically invents a new style to represent the resort life of Atlantic City, your Monopoly board, the Blue Squares, or the Price hotels. And this is the world that is the future. And I look at this and I see the top of the Trainwalk, and I see Raymond Hood's American Radiator in New York, 1924, that everybody says is the beginning of Art Deco, except it's really looking at Will Price in 1914. And the big Art Deco show that gives the style the name is 1925 in France, and the Trainwalk drawings have been exhibited all over Europe in 1919 to 1921. So this is the building that seeds modern design all across Europe and all across America, because Atlantic City was the celebrity resort. It was the Hollywood of its day. So, and then this is his real conclusion on this set of ideas. This is America, and art is the utterance of the living and not the dead. And when you see the interior of the Trainwalk, it's just breathtaking. This is modern, powerful, extraordinary. The room on the upper right is the submarine grill, which is under an outdoor terrace that had a gigantic round fish pond on the terrace with a glass bottom that was transparent, and at night they would shine spotlights through the fish tank, and the fish swimming around, their shadows would be on the dance floor with you as you were dancing. This was Captain Nemo's submarine underwater. Just fabulous. And then the other crazy thing, over there to the left, that big round ball is a fountain within a hollow glass globe that had goldfish swimming around the bottom, and a pump and a pipe around yay big. And the goldfish would get sucked out into the glass globe, where they would magnify to the size of the shell, and then they would shoot back down. It's just amazing. And this is showmanship, commercial architecture. It's fun. Architecture is exciting. He wants people to come to Atlantic City and have a good time. The amazing thing is that the submarine grill walls were painted away by N.C. Wyeth. And this is the N.C. Wyeth cartoon, oil cartoon, that he gave Will when Will got him the job to do his first big mural project. And he remembered Will sitting in the house across the street, preaching the virtues of modernity, saying that this is where we live and this is what we have to do, and we have to make everything of the world that we're in. And when he described Will Price in his diary, it was the word modernity repeated over and over that told you who Will Price was. So that brings me to the end, which is that in Rose Valley, Will had a cohort of friends who loved him for his adventure, who loved him for the ideas that he represented, both as the artsman, but also as the creator of communities. And he brought C.R. Ashby over from England, and Ashby was looking at American modern architecture, and he gets here and he talks about how wonderful Will is, and says that Will reminds him of Frank Lloyd Wright, who he's met in Chicago. And it creates this line. I just wanted you to see them all. Frank, Louis, Will, Lou Kahn, and Bob and Denise Venturi. A line that was alive, really, well, Denise is alive and still writing, not building anymore. A line that has continued all the way to our present, and that tells an important story. But the other great line is George Howe, who had studied in the Furness office when he got out of school and ran the office for a couple of years, and then went off to World War I and came back and did history for a few years, and then realized his error and writes this incredible article, what is this modern architecture trying to express? And he says in it that America has always been the land of lone prophets without much but posthumous honor in their own country. And Wright, Sullivan, and Price were among the first to grasp the architectural possibilities of the new life and the new means of construction. Their names were known in Europe while they remained comparatively obscure among their fellow countrymen. What was incredible, when I found this quote, no one knew who that Price was. I knew. There were other Price architects, but I knew it had to be Will, because Howe was still competing with the Price firm for buildings in Philadelphia. And what I also realized is that Howe was creating his own narrative here. Because what do they all share? The experience in the Furness shop, which Howe had been in as well. So he, in a sense, he doesn't say Wright, Sullivan, Howe, Sullivan, Price, and Howe. He leaves himself out. But if you reconstruct back, you realize the importance that George Howe is telling you in 1930 that there were three major modern American architects, and they all shared Frank Furness and his group. Thank you.